All right. So you guys see my screen okay? Okay. So when, why, and how to pivot is one of the topics. First thing this morning, one of the reasons we'll bring that up is to talk about, in case you don't get in the program for this cohort and you find out what not to do, I want to walk you through how to think about making a pivot and when you should make a pivot. We're talking about product and company roadmaps. One of the things about what you're trying to sync up in your 18-month window for preparing to for your fundraising activities, because this is going to be kind of the same mechanic you're going to use as you go into fundraising round 1 and fundraising round 2. How do you sync up the staffing plan, your budget with your product roadmap, with what you're communicating for what you fundraise? We'll walk you through kind of why that. And then fundraising 101 will cover things like, what's the right investor profile? How much money should I be raising? What are the mechanics of the fundraising process? Because it's really an enterprise sales process that you're using to help better understand what you need to do to manage the sales process, right? Which is getting lots of people at the top of the funnel and then working them through the process. So if you're not familiar with enterprise sales, we'll walk through the mechanics of how to do that. And then last, we'll go straight to pitch reviews and then continue to give you feedback from yesterday. Overall, I thought the progress from yesterday's was really good, right? So I think we've got some good opportunity to make some improvement today. And then tomorrow I'll be on for the second half of your call. So in the morning, you'll be doing legal review and hearing from some other founders who have gone through the program in the past. And then the second half, Ali Salah and I will be joining you on pitch reviews for kind of final prep. And then you'll need to take that feedback and go back and make those changes before your time on the 20th. This one's a little bit easier this time. So last time we did this, or a couple other boot camps I've done where it's gone from, we do final pitch reviews and then you're scheduled to do your finals the next day. Like, it's super rough. So if you guys thought the pace of the last 2 days was tough, this one's actually fairly leisurely, so which is good. We're learning as we go. So that's topic and agenda for today. So as we go through, feel free, ask questions as we go, etc. Okay. All right. From a pivot standpoint, pivoting's one of those things that, if you think about it, it's not an iteration in the business, it's a wholesale change of the business. So probably one of the most famous, a couple famous ones there is, if you guys remember Odeo. Odeo was in the blog or the podcasting business, and it became Twitter. So they literally went back to their investors and said, hey, we'll give you your money back if you like, or we'll give you the pro rata stake of your money back if you like. And some folks, some of their investors said yes, and most of their investors said no. So Jack Dorsey and team said, hey, we have this new idea that this isn't working. Now, it's funny now because podcasting's boomed, right? But when you think about when they started doing podcasting before it became Twitter, the answer was, wow, that's a really big shift, right? So Odeo became Twitter. Slack, if you know the Slack's backstory, was that the tool was actually designed for a game. So it was an online gaming company who'd built this really great communications tool and platform for users to connect with each other. So they actually pivoted from a B2C gaming company to a B2B enterprise company. So that was one of the other kind of big famous pivots. But if you think about it, the magnitude of the pivot was massive, right? It wasn't like an iteration in your go-to-market strategy or a change in your pricing. So in my mind, a pivot is, we were in the tires business and now we're in the airplane business. Like, it's a huge change. And they're typically painful, right? So because it's like, it may have the right people, may not have the right people. So when you think about if you get to a point, what I'm after for you is to figure out, like, when should we know that we need to make a pivot? And a lot of it just comes down to, is the shift there's outside shifts in the business. Obviously, COVID's been a huge one. That, are we on the right path or not? Do we have tailwinds with COVID, or do we have headwinds with COVID? So from that perspective, it may be that external factors have changed that'll drive the pivot. It may be that it, your customers aren't accepting the product that you thought you were going to build, right? But for whatever reason, I'd rather have you. I'm a big fan of the concept of don't fail fast, but kill bad ideas fast, right? Because I've failed and I've succeeded both. And you learn more from the failure than you learn from the success, for sure. But the fact that people are like, oh, you can't call it a failure, you learn from it. It's like, no, I didn't return shareholder capital, so it was a failure, right? And to not acknowledge that is to not acknowledge the pain that you went through in the process, right? And the hard thing about startups and the weird thing about startups is when you think the tide is all the way out, you actually can go further out. And what you find is you end up standing in a desert. It has nothing to do with the tide. Like the ocean was never there. So you just have to look at it and go, when do you pivot? When do you make the change? And why? So, but you'll face lots of iterations, right? There'll be lots of changes and flipping around and figuring out like, oh, that didn't work as a strategy. But you don't want to go too long where it's just the change is painful, right? So my encouragement to you is think about some of the famous pivots, and they finally looked at it and said, oh, hey, the market's not buying what we're selling. We should really figure out what we want to do. So from the when and the why perspective, you don't want to pivot too quickly and always be pivoting. That's not the point of the discussion. But if you're 90 to 180 days in and you're not getting traction and you're not seeing momentum and the customers aren't buying, then I would look at it and go like, oh, maybe this is a time to pivot. So part of that is, especially if you don't make it into this cohort, is what I think time is a good constraint, right, for your startup. So if you, there was an idea, I think I mentioned it to you guys in passing the other day. There's one of the ideas I was working on I was kind of trying to recruit somebody and see if, hey, does the market like this idea or not? And the idea was to build a software package where you could come in and connect your QuickBooks file or your Xero file and your other information about your early stage startup. So I could create a benchmark so you could see if how your company compared to your peer set. We're a B2B software subscription company. How does our growth compare to a peer set at the similar stage? Like, are they growing faster than us? Is their ROAS faster than us? And as we went through the process, it was a couple interesting things that we discovered. One was that obviously startups don't have any money to spend on it, right? That was not a new surprise, but we thought if we could get a big enough data set of the benchmarks, so we could get venture capital to pay for it, right? But as having come from venture capital and been in venture capital, one of the things that we saw was that VCs just don't pay for anything. So, so we looked at it and said, okay, well, that's a huge challenge by itself. And what we need to do at scale, you would have this great data set so that you could get comparable companies. But the question was, is how long would it take you to get to scale? And we're talking how many years would it take you to get to scale? And then when we looked at it, it was really like, oh, like I was talking with Nora about, it was kind of a window business, right? It was something that was super useful to you in the early days when you didn't have any money, but when you grew the company, the answer was it was a lot less useful to you. So instead of having a great lifetime value that could be in years, our lifetime value was probably going to be maybe 9, 12, 18 months. So in the grand scheme of things, we kind of looked at it and said, like, this just isn't a big enough business. Like, not that it was a bad business, right? It could have been a great lifestyle business, but it wasn't a big enough business to spend time on to really have it be like, oh, can it be $100 million business? So keep in mind, I've grown a couple of businesses to, $40 million and plus, and $40 million is a tough number, but your first real big milestone is $1 million in revenue. And then you want to go from $1 million to 5 and 5 to 10 and show that momentum over the course of time. If you're not getting there, and the question is it really a venture scale business? So you can still grow a good business, right? But, and again, this isn't a judgment of right or wrong, but as investors look at it, I want to look at it and say, I see how you get this $1,000 a year subscriber to a $10,000 a year subscriber if you're B2B, or if you get this $1,000 a year lifetime value if you're a B2C, or $500. I see how you get 1 million of them instead of 10,000 of them, right? So what, as far as me and where I want to spend my personal time on, if I was to do a startup again, I want to make sure it's a big enough idea that actually had a big payoff. Now, as founders, what's weird about it is we love our ideas. Like we love them to no end. We'll stay with them forever. This sounds like a bad relationship, right? Because you're like, I'm in this relationship, and the hard part is from your perspective is you're the founder. You've taken a little bit of investment money from friends and family, and now you're kind of stuck. So the outside factors I would tell you is if you're not getting traction in 90 to 180 days, you're not seeing customer growth. You've done the customer interviews, right? You've done 50 to 100 customer interviews, and you've built an email list, and you've done all the mechanics on the side of like what we talked about in the last 2 days of what you need to go do, but you're not seeing the traction. Then I would look at it and say, it's probably worth considering, hey, is this the right idea or not? And it's a hard question to ask, but I would rather see you pivot and kill a bad idea fast than have you fail and then be like, oh, I'm not going to be a founder, right? Or I'm not going to go work on an idea. So just know that's the kind of my mindset to it, because, you know, when one of my companies that we shut down in 2008, or end of 2008, 2009, because of the recession. We were growing, compound annual growth rate was going up, monthly growth rate was good. All of those things were on the right path. But what wasn't happening was when the market tanked, we lost all of our revenue. We lost, it's like, oh, well, we can just like quickly pivot. But what I didn't see was there was no quick pivot, right? So I drove the company into, I took a lot of personal savings. I kept the team around 6 months longer than I should have. At personal expense, ended up closing everything down. And in retrospect, I was too positive about it, right? Because you're optimistic by nature. That's the nature of who we are. Or we wouldn't do these things. Like it's kind of crazy, because everybody knows the math and everybody knows it doesn't apply to them, like I mentioned a couple of days ago. So I would encourage you to look at it and go, 90 to 180 days. If we're not getting the traction, ask yourself some hard questions. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
What you're saying that it's better to have for a customer to have a 12-month plus lifetime value versus acquiring a higher number of customers. But I think it's
I think it's the both. Way I see
it, it's both. Okay, so because for example, let's say, and I've seen similar models to us in the States, mm-hmm. And Europe, they're very lucrative. So let's say you only have 5,000 customers. That's $1.5 million a year in revenue.
Yeah, but it's not recurring. So let me be clear. It's not a bad thing, right? Ideally, what you want to do then is look at it and go, how do I get 10,000 customers, and how do I sell more to the 5,000 companies or customers I already have, right? So the question you're going to deal with from a strategy perspective is, how do I increase my lifetime value? Because I'm always trying to increase my lifetime value, and I'm always trying to lower my cost of customer acquisition. So that may mean you sell them a different product, you create an affiliate program in your case, where you refer them to other things. You re-engage them, right? So for the folks who are in the Souq business, it's a question of like, how many times a year will Dave buy, right? So I'm going to adjust my customers based on cohort. But my big picture question here is, if you're not getting the traction in the category that you thought, then you need to think about it's time to pivot, right? And it really starts with that customer development stuff. If you've done the customer development interviews, and it's why I'm such a fan of getting your 50 to 100 interviews under your belt, because it will change how quickly you grow in the trajectory of the growth of the company. But if you do those 50 interviews over, 10 months, the answer is it's kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's just brutal, right? So I'd be like, especially if you don't get into this phase of the cohort, like I would make my first priority, go do the customer interviews now, prove that people say, yeah, I will buy it if you sell it, right? And even to the extent, like one of the things I've tested, back to somebody's question yesterday, would you spend $10,000 on product or $10,000 on ad spend? I've actually done the $10,000 on ad spend, sent people to a landing page, given them the checkout page, and then thrown them a 404 error and not take their credit card. But I wanted to see how far along I could get them to the point of like, oh, put in your credit card information. Right now, I threw them an error and I didn't grab their credit card information. But the point is I wanted to see how far through the checkout process they would go. So, which is weird because people are like, well, aren't you going to disappoint customers? And the answer is, it's an MVP. I'm always going to disappoint a customer. Right. So, but I would rather know in advance that I could get them all the way to the point of purchase rather than have just a hypothesis about it. So, if you don't make it into the program, think of that as your mechanic. Yeah.
Okay, so now if we pivot, this is because I feel like a 90 days period is a short period. Sometimes some things require patience. It's just a matter of, being able to penetrate the market. So like it's a matter of patience, but you're doing it at the expense of investors. Shouldn't you be just transparent to the investors about this is the time period that I'm expecting to bring traction to my company, and then on those bases test?
For sure. So, and again, 90 to 180 days is an arbitrary, if you're in the enterprise software space, it's going to take you a while because to build a whole solution, right, is going to require that you have to build more product, right? So there's no straight deadline here or formula. It's more of a guideline that says, if you haven't done the customer interviews, go do the customer interviews for sure, right? And there's times to be patient because the market hasn't. The challenge with us as founders is you're a visionary in your segment, right? You see the future as if it exists. The problem is that the market may not mature as fast as we hope it's going to mature as founders. And sometimes the market doesn't mature at all, right? Which is the hard one. You're like, oh, I see how this is going to happen, right? It's just over the horizon line. And the fact is it's a long freaking horizon line. So I'm not telling you to kill the company or quit if you don't get into the program. I'm just saying at some point you'll have hard mechanics and ideas you have to address. This is the way you do it, right? In that you need to, setting a time frame for yourself. One of the things I find when I work with founders is we as founders are often stuck in our head, right? And we'll hunker down and be super focused on something. And what we really need to do is get out of the building and go talk with customers, get their feedback, and then ask them in the customer development interview question is, if this was to fail, why would it fail? Oh, well, we already have customer relationships where, they're okay. Like the product we're buying today is fine, right? And it's not, your solution isn't 10x better, right? It's just 1x better, right? And everybody's like, well, it's okay, right? So those are the things I just want you to think about, because as you think about pivots, they're hard, right? Quitting is hard, but I'd rather have you have some runway, make a pivot and take a second shot at it, than go all the way to the end of your runway and go like, we're just out of money and we're done, right? And then as a founder, the answer is, and I'm exhausted. So that's just a little coaching from me. If you don't get into the program yet, prioritize the customer development interviews and keep going. But set a emotional and date-based timeline for yourself to either get the customer development interviews done or ask the hard question of like, is this really a good idea or not? Make sense?
Dave, will you be with us in the program as a mentor?
I will be occasionally. So yeah, it kind of depends. Like in the stage, I'll be demo day for sure. I may come back in as a mentor. When I was traveling, if I was going to be in a region, I would do a couple of different programs. We haven't really kind of figured it out from an online perspective since. But yeah, I'll be, and you guys feel free from a LinkedIn perspective. You have all my contact information. Like if you have a question, reach out, happy to do it. I have a pretty simple rule from an advisory standpoint, right? I'm happy to answer any questions and be available. If something pops up and you have a question, feel free. I don't join advisory boards. Generally, I'll only do a few a year because what's going to happen is you guys raise money, right? And we'll talk about it on the fundraising side, is you're typically going to raise a couple rounds of funding, right? So in a typical advisor agreement is a half a percentage point, so by the time you take a half a percentage point and run it through 2 rounds of funding, it's like 15 bips. And the answer is, like, call me, right? Is the answer.
What if the company would be worth like $500 million US? Like, you wouldn't know. So it's still an opportunity.
We'll know in 10 years. So my answer is pay it forward and do it for another founder, right? Because if I don't get a couple percentage points on the early stage, it's not worth my time to do it, and it's more distraction for the founders. So I only do a couple of them a year, and typically I'd rather put in a small check, and because for me, the information, like having me think about your company, is more useful than my check, right? Because I write small checks, relatively speaking. So this isn't, by no means, this is not a pitch about I should be your advisor, not my point, right? My point is that after 2 rounds of funding, what you're after is, how do I keep my as much equity as possible, right? If you have an advisor that knows your industry segment, you're gonna pay that advisor roughly a 0.25% to 1%, right? And that's worthwhile for them but you need to give them structure for how they add value to your company, right? We'll talk about quarterly planning in the next section. Like, the thing that I like to do is, like, I'm a solid board member, because one of the things I push is like, okay, what are you going to do this quarter, next quarter? Like 3 quarters out, I'm glad you have a vision for it, but the fact is so much is going to change, right? that I want you to be focused on, like, and the other thing I will talk about in a bit is, like, important things we're not doing now, right? As a founder, one of the challenges you have is you have all kinds of ideas, everything you can do, but you have less resources than ideas. So you have to identify stuff that's like, oh, that's going to go on my list, of important things I'm not doing now. My buddy came up with the phrase ITINDY. So important things we're not doing yet, right? So the ITINDY list is going to go on your list of things you're like, that's a great idea, but we already have a full plan for the next 2 quarters. Like, we may get to it next year. So you want to capture those ideas, because it may be a brilliant idea, right? But what you find is, as the founder, especially as you grow the company and you're 25 people or something like that, is you can't be whipsawing your team around, right? The team needs to plan, execute, do their daily stand-ups, execute on your, and go make momentum. And if you as the founder is always whipsawing people around, and I say that from firsthand experience, right? That was my first startup. I'm like, oh, we should, my team finally said, here is your own personal developer, so you can go test ideas, because you can't be whipsawing us around as a team. And we had 150 people, right? So, so customer development, do that process. If you don't get in, know that what you're doing is setting some time frame that's reasonable before you run out of capital or personal savings, right? It could be like, right, for many of you, you're at the point right now of, like, it's all about personal savings or all about the side hustle. But I still want to have it, if it's a side hustle, I still want you to be focused on the fact that, okay, I want to set some milestones. And if I don't hit the milestones, it's not a hard and fast, I'm going to quit. It's I'm going to give this a hard look. That's all I'm after. So, and it comes back to the customer and the pain point. So how do you pivot? Right. So I think one of the things that is interesting is you may look at it and say, well, I've done the research on this market. I still like this market, but we're approaching it with the wrong product. Or I still like this product, but we're totally going after the wrong market, right? And I would look at that one and go, that's probably more of an iteration. Like, it was like, we built this product, but the product's actually it's not resonating with the customer. So we need to go after an entirely different customer base. So that's one way that is a change of direction. Or is the product wrong, right? Or is the brand wrong? But again, I think to go back to in the very first day of the program, the thing I mentioned is have an acute focus on the problem, not on the solution. Because what I want you to focus on is, like, find if it's a good target market and you're truly focused on the problem, then what you should be able to do is find a product in that solution. The thing that I want to highlight to you is that the average time from startup to first venture capital in is about 4 years, 3 or 4 years. The average time from venture capital in to exit is about 8 years, right? So if you're not in love with this market, right, if you're not super passionate about it, like passion's critical, but not sufficient, right? It will not get you over the long haul. So if this one is like, I've had a bunch of folks I've been around who are like, I just want to be a founder and I'm looking for a good idea. And I'm like, I'm not sure how well that works, right? Because you're like, if you're not passionate about the idea, it's hard to get all the way over the goal line, right? Because it's just going to take you a long time. So, and I've seen a bunch of founders at the end, they're like, yeah, I was never super passionate about the idea. And frankly, we were just exhausted. So, right. So again, this sounds negative. It's not meant to sound negative. It's more to give you a guideline of like, if you don't get in, how long should you pursue it? What should you do? And what are the mechanics? Just make sure you prioritize your customer development mechanics first.
Dave, just interrupting you here regarding the timing. If you think like you have opened a business and it was on the wrong timing, but you know for a fact it is coming. So what do you think? Will you close the business or you will keep it asleep? Which choice you will go for?
So my personal experience has been like whether I pause the business or whether I close the business. My personal experience, depending on how long the runway is, you've gone up to that date, it really comes down to how much emotional energy have you put into it, where you're like, do I feel like I could restart it again? So give you the case in point with my first company, we grew it from 0 to 32 million in 4 years, finished 42 million after 5 years. We thought the market it was already $1 billion market, but we thought it would grow to be a $4 billion market. In that 4 years, it went from $1 billion market to $1.2 billion, right? Okay. So we still, as a startup, we still grew really fast, but the market didn't grow as fast as we thought it would, right? So, and I would say that we had this, so we had two things that were in our favor in the pitch deck, right? That were actually, one was true, right? One, we could take market share because nobody was doing what we were doing and nobody liked the existing process. But the compound annual growth rate on top of that, we thought was going to boom. So we'd go from 40 million to 100 million in revenue. And the answer was
always you think that you are going to boom. It will go to take off, but right. Still, like it was a 3D business. So okay, you sold printers to all the university. Then what? How many universities are there? Then you will keep maintaining them. So
and the product lasts 20 years, but your lifetime value is 1 year.
Yeah. However, in US or in other countries, no, it's booming because it's getting into the manufacturing. It's getting into different things. So really, it is sometimes you think about it, keep it, or. Yeah, although we try to do the vivid things like from selling to providing service to do many injections, but it did not.
And it's really if you're doing the work, right? So I think if you all look at it and you're honest with yourself and say, hey, we're doing the work, but the market's not maturing, or this isn't happening, or right, or outside factors, right? A big competitor gets funded, right, and if you require capital for growth, one of the things that happens is a big competitor gets funded and they suck all the oxygen out of the capital raise area, right? So it's like I'm trying to compete against a market that's already super well funded, right? So even though Lyft will survive, right, Uber sucked all the oxygen out of the capital markets, right? So there was a company called Sidecar early on as well. Don't know if you guys remember Sidecar. General Motors bought them. But they raised $150 million and ended up selling to General Motors because Uber had already sucked the oxygen out of the room, right? So again, it's just this isn't meant as a discouragement. This is meant as a guideline for how you should think about.
Because also, look, we were going like as, a small partner, not going for like, funding or something. Maybe that's why we could not like really scale up. That's why now we are having another strategy with this FaceKey business.
Yeah, totally. And I think that the big takeaway is like it takes the same amount of time like in years to grow a small company as it does to grow a large company.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you're going to do it, I would encourage you to like go grow a large company. Like that's it's a much better idea. And again, not it's just the reality of doing a startup, right? The math on startups is startups fail. A lot of startups fail because they've never done the customer development work in the first place, and it was never a good idea, right? In your guys' case, you've done a lot of the work, you've made it this far. So now the question is like, okay, if I don't get in, if I do get in, what do I want to understand about it? And outside market factors, you know, we're true believers, right? As a founder, that's the definition of who we are.
Yeah.
Right.
And the good things, like we do things in parallel. So this did not work. The other business, good things that it is work. Like, so it's good that turning
and I've done it
ideas into money.
How sick is that?
So
probably,
at least something is covering. Yeah.
Yeah, probably because I can't have a job, right? I'm not really employable. That might be part of the problem. So from a pivot perspective, and frankly, this should apply for you today as well. If you think about your customer's pain level, right? You don't want to be in the low pain area. You want to be in the area where the customer's like, oh my gosh, that is such a huge pain. If you can solve that problem and the pain, I will pay you for it, right? On one axis, and the other axis is their willingness to pay and part with the dollars. And that one people ask later, right? They tend to focus on oh, is this a pain for the people? Oh yeah, it's a pain. But then when you ask them if they're willing to pay, their answer is like, oh yeah, or the confirmation bias I've run into. A friend of mine started a company and they went out and did all the customer development interviews, and their thesis was, could we create a video platform that curates videos for your kids and help them understand what their career choices were? Because there's tons of videos out on the web, but how do you find the right ones, right? If your kid wants to be an architect. And he went out and did all the customer development interviews, and all the parents were super enthusiastic, right? All the parents were like, oh yes, that's a great idea. I can keep my kids from stuff they don't want to see or they don't want them to see. And I can help them understand curated videos of what they should see and help them be inspired. And so Brian went out and built it. And then he rolled it out and asked the parents, he's like, okay, here's what we did. You know, give us your credit card information. And the parents were like, oh, well, I don't want to give you my credit card information. Right. So for the confirmation bias of the customer was, for the parents, do you want to do good things for your kids? And the answer is always yes. Right. But when they were asked to actually put their credit card down and pay for it, the answer was, not so yes. So just know that as you go through the process, until you ask for that willingness to pay, you could be getting just confirmation bias. This sounds like the right thing to say. But when you ask them the willingness to pay metric as well, that'll help you really determine, like, okay, here's where we're at, and am I really willing to pay or not? That's why I'm also a fan of start with higher pricing and discount, then start with lower pricing and wish or hope you can raise prices later, right? So it just gives you a chance to figure out what your price range is, and you'll figure it out. If you're seeing the conversion rates go down, and there's a new competitor and their product has a better user interface and the price needs to go down, you'll see that as well. And you always have to be watching for those early signals. So any questions about pivots?
I have a quick question about this. Does it hold true for B2B sales as well? Is it, I mean, how more about the reliability of customer development B2B versus B2C? Is it, did you have experience of companies going out to 50 enterprise or businesses and asking, would you pay for this, getting positive feedback and then having the companies not actually paying? Or is it less likely to happen in B2B than in B2C, in your opinion?
It's less likely to happen in B2B than B2C because I'm spending somebody else's money. Right. So I'm more apt to take a risk on a product because it's not, it's my company credit card, not my personal credit card. Right. So human nature, however, at the core of it is still the same, which is I'd like to help you out if I can. Right. So I'm going to be probably more positive than I need to be. And giving hard feedback is hard. So you still have to be, what you're asking for on the B2B side, and frankly, what you're asking for on the B2C side is what's the price range you would be willing to pay in those early customer development interviews, right? Because you're like, oh, if we launch with this feature, you know, because what you're trying to, there's this concept that Clayton Christensen came up with from Harvard Business School called jobs to be done. So the jobs to be done framework is basically, today you're using Excel spreadsheets and 20% of this person's time. So if I take your annual salary at $50,000 and 20% of your time, okay, I'm now at 10%, I'm at $10,000 at cost is what you're currently doing, but that cost is hidden, right? I don't think of it as a direct cost associated with the product you're building. But if I broke it down and looked at it as a jobs to be done framework, I would look at it today and say, well, we're spending about $10,000 today annually to do that. And if you said, well, if I could do it for you for $2,000, would you do it? And there's a cognitive dissonance with the customer, right? They're going to look at it and say, well, what will I do with that person? Right. And the answer is, well, I'd put them on something that's more useful. Right. But the initial cognitive dissonance is like, well, no, I like that person and that person's been around a long time. And right. So for whatever reason, they're going to think about like, how do I repurpose that person? And the concept there is if I have to repurpose my workflow and you're going to change my workflow, then it's creating friction. And is that friction, is your savings more valuable than the friction that's created otherwise? So that's just, most customers won't think about it that deliberately, but that's the way you need to think about it as a product owner, is how do I take friction out of their life and how do I improve the quality of their life? Like my example that I used a couple of days ago about like most of my customers just wanted to get to their kid's soccer game on Saturday, you know, or over the weekend. That's what they were after. So the idea that it was something else other than that was less so. So less the case in B2B, but that's kind of the way it manifests itself when you ask the questions.
Yeah. This is consistent with our. I mean, when providing UX UI improvements, what we get in interviews is okay, but what are UX UI people gonna do now? I mean, it's like we are, this clash you are mentioning is strong in our case. So
yeah. Yeah, because you're disrupting some of the workforce by using AI tools to take away some of the testing and provide some intelligence to it. So you have to position it as, hey, your UX UI people get to work on more creative problems, more problem-solving problems, right? It's not that the problems are going away, it's that you have to repurpose what they're doing. And that may be part of your value proposition, right? Depending on, within B2B, the difference is you have, there's a bunch of people in a business organization who can say no to your product, and there's probably only a few who can say yes, right? So in any complex selling model, so spin selling or strategic selling is kind of the two difference that have been around for years, right? Is you're answering, I have got a buyer and a user profile, and then I've got a bunch of people I have to sell on why they should use the product, because they can only say no, but they can't say yes. Right. So I have to get, the UX people aren't going to make the decision about whether they're going to use your product or not. It may come from finance, from budget. It may come from marketing, but you need to give the UX people a reason to approve your product. Otherwise they'll undercut your sales process. Right. So, and that's true for any of you that are doing B2B, is like, unless you're selling small and medium business where the CEO is the UX person as well. Right. All right, other questions about pivots before we move on?
Yes, Dave,
yeah.
How do you pivot when you have a strong newcomer copying your idea, but bettering it without you expecting? Do you just take your business again on like reverse engineering, or you just try to cope with them? Especially when you're starting up, you don't have that much capital to inject in your business. So what do you do in that case?
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at the capital runway and how much capital they've raised. So yours is a case in point. I mentioned OfferUp to you the other day. There was another competitor product for them called Letgo.
Letgo, yeah, they bought it off, yeah.
Okay, so Letgo ended up getting purchased by OfferUp. They ended up merging. Yeah. But for a while, it was an arms race, right? I mean, there were TV ads. I'm like, TV ads is crazy, right? Because it's super expensive. But the idea there was somebody else got, one of them got well funded, and the other one got well funded, and then OfferUp ended up buying Letgo. Don't know the price, but the idea there is if you get into a battle like that, it's really about who has the capital and the runway and the guts, right? Because there's some bluffing going on too, right? So it's like, and if I'm not a poker player, but what I understand about, you have to know what your timing is, right? Based on the math of whether you're going to push in or not push in. I have a friend who's a professional poker player, and the rule of thumb was always, if you looked around the table and you couldn't tell who the mark was, you were the mark, right? So I was always looking around the table going, yeah, no, everybody here knows how to play this game better than I do, so I don't want to play the game, right? So you just have to look at it and go, if somebody's a super well-funded competitor, what am I going to do? Right? It's a hard question. Hopefully you run into that problem, because that's a validation of the problem that you're going to, right? Of that, oh, the market really does care. This is really a great idea. Now the question is do I have access to capital like my competitor does or not? And what do I need to do to get access to capital? And that one definitely happens, right? I can look back to the 2008, or frankly, a bunch of them that are going to happen now, right? Of like, oh, that company was a really great idea. Their market timing was just bad, right? And COVID's outside of your control, right? My accountant at one point, because accountants are known for being super risk takers, my accountant had seen like my assets grow and fail, and like this, he's like, your timing's really bad. Like anybody can actually pick timing, right? So connecting dots is something you do looking backwards, not something you do looking forwards. Right. So you can understand all these things as you look backwards on them, but when you're in the midst of it, you're making real-time decisions about it. Okay. So the nature of that doesn't change very much. Okay. Any other questions about pivots before we move on? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about product, and then we'll take a coffee break. From a product perspective, what I'm after, and one of the things that you're going to be selling on, is the idea of, I've got both a product vision, which is the long-term view and the vision of what I'm going to do. And we talked about this as Mount Everest with Basecamp, right? So the folks want to know that you have a vision in a direction that you're going to go, but I also want to know that you have a plan for how you're going to get there. So I think if you're in the business to business space in particular, right, where you have to build out enterprise software that's going to take you a few years to build out, you want to know that you're on the right path to get to that end vision, because it's going to take you longer to build. If you're building an app, you can build it much faster, but you have to get to thousands of users and not hundreds of users, right? So I would want to know, so as an investor, if your annual contract value in the case of AI and doing UX stuff is in your annual contract value is $1,000, I want to know how you can get to $100,000. So if you think of Zoom today, Zoom's conference call that they just did recently was one of the things they talked about was how few customers paid them more than $1 million a year. So one of the things they were selling Wall Street on was, hey, we still have lots of room to go up market and get more revenue per company, right? Versus revenue per individual. Like the $50 I pay Zoom per month is immaterial to what they need to do to increase it. But if they get a million more people paying them $50 a month, that's great. But they were also saying, and we can grow the average revenue per user on an annual basis. So what you're after with your product vision, if you're building enterprise software, you have to be selling the vision, but also selling the MVP. So that's my Basecamp / Mount Everest analogy. And so I want to know that you're going to get to Basecamp. I want to know that from Basecamp, you have a plan for how you're going to scale the mountain. Like for Everest, there's some treacherous paths, but you don't want to be circling around the mountain for years, right? That's just not the right way to do it. So product vision is, I know the problem we're solving. We have good vision to the problem we're solving. We validated that idea with the customers. And now what we're doing is we have a plan for how we're going to go do that. So what features are you going to ship first? When are you going to ship those features? And then making sure you have the customer input for them to look at it and go, okay, the customers have told me that if I had a choice between these 3 features, I'd rather have this one first. So I want you to have a point of view on it, but I want you to be able to go ask your customer and say, hey, I know you said you wanted this feature. We're shipping it in 6 months. Is that fast enough? Right? Because especially for you that are not technical, one of the challenges is that you'll underestimate how long it takes you to build something. So I'm not super technical, but I taught myself to code because I was frustrated with, you know, the feedback from somebody who said, hey, it's going to take us 6 months to build something. I'm like, really? Can't we build that over like a hack it together over a weekend? Right. And that's really the perspective of somebody who's not a developer. Right. So I taught myself to code so I could figure that out. And I just wanted to be able to benchmark it. Not that I've never been fast at it, but at least I was technical enough to understand like, oh, like order of magnitude, how hard is this to build? That's the outcome I was after, was how difficult is this? So know that that's what you're balancing. I don't know what the right colloquialism is, but it's 2 sides of the same coin, right? I have to be able to sell the product vision, but I have to be able to sell the how I'm going to get there. What we see in the Seattle market compared to Silicon Valley is the investors in the Seattle market really want you to show how you're going to get to revenue, where investors in Silicon Valley want to show that it's $1 billion idea, right? Which frustrates the founders because they're like, oh, well, I went out and sold the $1 billion idea to the investors in Seattle, and the investors like, yeah, but how are you going to get to revenue, right? And then I went to go talk to Silicon Valley investors, and I told them how I was going to get to revenue, and they wanted a $1 billion idea. Right. So the founders get frustrated because they feel like they're getting told different things. And the answer is you are, right? And you're kind of threading the needle, right? Is you have to be able to sell the vision. How is this a big idea? Right. With the tactical, how do I get to 5,000 customers? Right. If I'm in Nora's mentioning in her numbers. And the answer is 5,000 is great, but I want 50,000 or 5 million customers, right? As an investor. So it doesn't mean it's a bad business. It just means that's the balance you're trying to strike, right? From a product vision standpoint. So for your MVP, most of you already have an MVP in planning, but just to touch on some MVP stuff, it's good to have your list of features, narrow that list. If you haven't done the PowerPoint or Keynote version of that list of product yet, so if you're still pre-product, especially as it relates to getting into the program, you'll see, you've heard from talking with a bunch of folks, there's a wide range of like, we have customers and we have revenue, to like, I have an idea. So if you're closer to that idea stage, what I want you to do is take the design thing that we talked about for your PowerPoint and turn that into functionally what looks and feels like your website. But I'm going to have you do a PowerPoint version of your MVP. So you can actually go out and show the customer like, oh, this is the way it works. And then you hit the next button. And your next button is just the right arrow, right? Where you're just like, I'm just showing you what it's going to look like, but it doesn't exist yet. So for those of you who have revenue, you're like, yep, been to this movie before. We've already kind of done that probably. And now we've built a product. So
I have a question. So Tripod's kind of at that stage. We have like a prototype that's not live, but it's designed fully, a full product roadmap that all bells and whistles, whatever. But of course, we need to tailor that down to about 5 features, only because there's payment aspect and there's a collaboration aspect, right? So in terms of how would you advise a startup, or what would you recommend that the startups go out to market with as an MVP? Is it to generate revenue on platform, or is it just to get traction of the number of users? Because that changes the features a lot. I mean, significantly.
Yeah, and so when it comes back to your revenue model, so for example, if you're trying to do network effect and there's a viral coefficient or a potential to have a K factor, the answer is it's all about user generation. Right. If the thesis you're trying to test is, well, like in your case, people have already proven with Upwork and Fiverr that they will put money into an escrow, projects will get completed, and they will get paid. So that's not a mechanic you have to test. It's already proven, right? For some of you with a brand new idea, the answer is no one's ever tested this before, so we just have to go test it. So in your case, I think like we talked about yesterday after the pitch, is the question there is how do you acquire projects at reasonable economics, right? So that you can, because finding the people to do the work is not really, that's not the test you're trying to find. If you have the projects, you'll find the people to do the work. So in your case, what's the unique set of features that allows you to capture the project scope or help? Like one of the hard parts for companies that are trying to find people to hire is, I don't know about you guys, but you know, scope documents are really freaking hard, right? I'm good at it at this point, but to write a scope document, like corporate innovation doesn't happen because big corporates have customers and revenue. They don't actually have problems, right? So if you're like, well, what problem are you trying to solve? And they're like, yeah, it's okay. Like our customers seem to be fine. And you're like, there's no like acute problem they're trying to solve. Because if there was, they'd be working on it, right? So how do I capture a problem? How do I scope the work? How do I help somebody bid on that project? Especially if it's still like fuzzy in my head, right? So that's one of the things I look at for years and go like, if you can figure out how to acquire customers, corporate accounts with projects, with budgets, and you can acquire it cheaper and better from the US and translate it into, you know, finding talent in rest of world, because that's the arbitrage you're taking advantage of, right?
Yeah. No, we're it's the flip. It's a project here with global talent, so that they tap into the global talent.
Right. So so you need to figure out, can we acquire those projects with budgets better than anybody else? Because then somebody like Upwork's going to go, oh, they've mastered this thing better than anybody in MENA, right? Which is like, they figured out how to create projects that have budgets, that have dollars to spend, and those projects turn into bigger projects because of this. And like, if that's the thing that you've mastered, then somebody like Upwork's going to come along and just go, let's buy them, right? Because that's the Instagram story with Facebook, right? So everybody looks at the numbers of Instagram's acquisition. And it's like, oh my God, the numbers are monster. And the reason is Instagram figured out customer acquisition that at a rate that was so much better than Facebook's. They just bought them at a super premium, right? So for both their existing base, but also for their growth. So I always look at that one and say, because when I sell a company, right, I'm like, what's the value I'm bringing to the company, right? Is my feature better than their feature? Because they're usually on different technology stacks and they're hard to integrate, right? And all those things. But one thing you can always count on, like if I know how to acquire customers at a better economic than they know how to acquire them, that's always valuable, right? Is the tech team valuable? Is the leadership team valuable, right? But customer acquisition is always valuable. So figuring out your customer acquisition for all you guys is super important. Like you need to have a thesis on it for sure. So, all right. So MVP, if you're still at prototype stage, go ahead.
Yeah, just brief question actually. For MVP, I'm just trying to understand really what we're trying to test by having an MVP, right? We already conducted the customer interview. I'm just being the other side of the argument and challenging this. We do have an MVP, but I want to see how much value we can get out of this. So there's a balance between, first, when you launch MVP, there's going to be a lot of customers who would be disappointed of what you're offering, right? Oh, this is really not a version of this. That's one. So how do you balance, especially I think launching in the US where there's launching in Silicon Valley or West Coast, people will accept that. But then launching in certain areas, people expect really, we have discussion where people expect everything in the product. So
the further east you get from the West Coast, the less willing the customers are to work with MVPs and the less accepting they are of failure, by the way.
Right. Right. And we're going really, really far east. So that's the thing. And second is that, like for Rasied, we're testing, basically basic features, but it's slimmed down from what we are expecting. So how do you balance that in terms of communication? How do you balance that in terms of staging this? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to be balanced. So Reid Hoffman, who started LinkedIn, he's kind of famous for the quote that says, if you aren't embarrassed of your MVP, you waited too long to ship it.
Right.
So you're always going to be a little bit embarrassed, and you're always selling the future, right?
Very-
Especially if you're business to business, right? Because you're always like, we're launching with this, but in 3 months or 6 months, we'll have that, right? So it's, and you're always looking for that feedback to say, I think that in 3 months we're going to have this, but if my customers come out and violently tell me they want something else, the answer is, I'll build something else, right? So you need the development momentum, right? And again, you're back to scarcity of resources, right? Because that's part of the challenge as well. But that's where you need to get clarity on the MVP. So I've launched an MVP that was, I think of it like Universal Studios, right? If you look at the building from the front, you're like, it looks like a 4-story building. But if you turn to the side of the building's about this wide, right? And it's just a movie prop. And frankly, there's times where I've launched an MVP that was just that, right? Or we've tested out the next feature, right? So that the customers are paying for this thing, and I'm like, we're going to go build this thing, but I mean, it looks like a movie prop, right? But I'm showing them from a design perspective what it looks like. I'm asking them if that's what they want, and I'm watching to see, how they react. And if they react with like, oh, that's awesome, like, yes, that's what I'm going to build. But if the answer is, if it comes across as like a meh, then the answer is, well, no, I'm not going to build that, right? I mean, keep in mind, there has to be enough customers in your universe, back to your total addressable market, that if you disappoint some initially, right, that's not the end of the customer pool. If that's the end of the customer pool, and that's how big your total addressable market is, you have a bigger problem, right? Which is your total market's like this big, right? And you talk to all 3 of them, and all 3 of them said no, and you're like, oh, you're right, we're out of business. Right. So you're gonna disappoint some customers up front, and you just need to get comfortable with that. It's not intentional, right? But they have to recognize like, this is really hard, right? And big company people don't get that, right? They wouldn't take the risk you're taking. Yep.
Question. So when it comes to testing our MVP, do we become selective over who we're gonna test it with? Because you don't want to kill the idea, because certain people, as you mentioned, now it might kill the, like, I think if I got you right, that they don't like testing the MVPs and at that stage, or at straw stage kind of thing. So do we select in order not to avoid that?
I would, if it was me, I would talk to everybody. So my perception is, there's always a concern that somebody's going to steal my idea. That has not been my experience. My experience is that ideas die from lack of exposure, not from overexposure. Right. So if I went out and talked to people, like I went out and talked to a ton of startups about this, benchmarking data idea. Right. And people are like, oh, did you ship that? And I'm like, no, we discovered that frankly, there just wasn't a way to make it into an interesting enough business. Would the founders have found that tool useful? Yes. Like, would have been interesting to build. And like, I'm a community first sort of guy, right? So I've done things that were like, oh, this was good for the community, without, answering the question, like, is it good for Dave? Right. And there's times where you're like, wait a minute, it has to be both, right? It has to be both good for the community and good for Dave. Otherwise Dave can't do it, right? Unless it's a charity project. And there's plenty of charity projects that are worthwhile, right? It just doesn't need to be your business. Right. So that's why I'm such a fan of, like, you have to have a path to how you make money. So yeah, I would go talk to as many people as I could talk to, knowing that some of them are going to be disappointed. And you have to sell it as if it exists. That's the hard part, right? You're like enthusiastically selling it like it exists today, and knowing full well that you're like, this is totally an MVP. So I'm not really a charlatan, but it feels that way at times.
So in this case, is it possible to have your MVP, you test out, and then you have your MVP at the same as your, like, for example, Beta 1.0?
Yeah,
given
for sure.
The market has accepted that MVP and its features.
Yep, for sure. Because what you're trying to do next is, like, I'm now going to use those customer interviews and the data to build out my product roadmap and prioritize what my build features are. Right. So it could be that in the case of Tripod, it's like, we've just gotten so good at helping, giving a tool, right, to help you scope your work and understand, like, so for you all, if you were like, hey, Tripod's going to help you build your MVP, what technical stack do you want it on? You're like, I don't know. Like, does it matter? right? So how do they help you define that in advance? Like, does the technical stack matter or not? It's like they're going to help you figure out how to scope your work, right? And that becomes their unique secret sauce. I'm not saying it is, by the way, but it becomes part of the thing that you go like, well, I go to these guys because they can help me figure out what the scope of my work is, right? So think of it again as it's an on-ramp product. It's like, if I'm trying to merge onto the freeway, what's the on-ramp that I use to get onto that, right? And your first feature should be very much around, I'm getting you into a product roadmap that helps you understand where you're going to go next. And then as the founder and CEO, I'm going to communicate a vision that helps you understand like, oh, we're going to go from here, and then we're going to go there, and then we're going to go over here, right? So that's kind of the product vision I want you to balance out, because what the committee wants to know when you pitch them on the 20th is this a big idea or not? Like if I have if I like the founders the same and I have two founders that are both in similar state, the question I want to ask is like, yeah, but is one of these a big idea, right? And if it is, I'm super excited about it, right? And as a portfolio company, the thing that I'm doing is I'm balancing out some of my portfolios like total flyers. Like, you know, there's a few of you are working on ideas that are completely new. And it's like, that's actually like, if it works, it would be a really big idea, but it may not, right? It may be done in 6 months, right? And some of you are working on like known, it's a copycat of an existing business that's already raised a ton of money. And you're like, that's not, the question is how does it grow, fill this market need, get big in this region so that it can get acquired, right? That's a very different use case. As I look at 10 companies in my portfolio, if I was just using 10 as an example, I'm going to go with a few flyers, right? Because if they work, they could be monsters, but the odds of them working are pretty small. And then I have some kind of safe bets, right? And I'm going to look at the total addressable market of Tripod's business compared to Upwork's business and go, do I believe that they can get to the MENA market this much faster, right? Or in the case of the team that's building Robinhood in MENA, it's like, okay, can they get there faster than Robinhood can get there? That's the bet that I'm making. Not all of the 10 in my portfolio are going to look the same, right? I'm going to have some that are more risky and some that are less risky. But when it comes time for the committee to make the decision about are you in or are you out, right? You have to sell both the vision and the fact that you can do the execution and do the MVP. For those of you who already shipped MVP, sorry we spent so much time on MVP, but it's worth noting for the folks who are here and still at that point in the stage. For those of you who already have an MVP, it's like you need the product roadmap, and you need to focus on like, how do I sell you on the vision and why this is a big market? So that's why the market data with the product vision is so important. Okay.
Dave, I got 2 questions for you, if you don't mind.
Yep. Go for it.
Number one, for the deck, the product roadmap, I'm trying to focus more based on what I've read about what you want on this very, like, it's just like you don't want it to be cluttered, right? Of course. So I'm trying to focus more on what's going on the first 3 quarters based on the investment, based on not even without the investment. What are we doing for the next 9 to 12 months? Okay. And how would it be different if we got involved together? This is number one. So that's what we're trying to focus on. We're not trying to actually add all the rest of the features of the product roadmap, which we already do have. So what do you think? Should we just stick to option A, or if they want, we can put option A and then show them the bigger picture, which includes what happens, the whole bonanza, you know?
Yeah. So I'm gonna thread the needle for you guys. So if you're on the more mature side that Mohammed is talking about, then I want you to flesh out your company roadmap, which I'll get to here in just a minute, which includes like, here's my staffing, here's my product, here's my, like, there's a list of things that you're going to go do, right? If you have that data. If you're at the MVP side, don't bluff that data. You're like, if the next quarter we need to ship an MVP, I need to hire a technical team. You're like, it's a bullet point list, right? If you're on the mature side of this discussion, right, you already have revenue, you already have product, and then you're going to have a much more robust product roadmap. It still doesn't need to be an eye chart, right? I'm a fan of, and I'll give you a structure, Mohammed, of how to work, what that structure is to work with. It's the same structure I use to manage a board if I'm either the CEO of the company or if I'm a board member of the company, right? And that format is, you know, people, because it's always people, right? Revenue, product, operations, finance, and important things I'm not doing now, right? But I'll give you a framework for how to do that. We then use that quarterly framework the same way in our board meetings. We update them, we roll them 4 quarters out, right? Because that's 3-4 quarters out, if you have revenue and you have a bank account, is like about as far out as you can plan. But you could look at it and go like, oh, you know, 5 quarters out, we need to hire, you know, a chief product officer, right? Depending on what, like whatever your key people moves are. For those of you who are at MVP stage and haven't shipped the product yet, what needs to be on your product and company roadmap slide is just a set of bullet points, right? Hey, over the next 90 days, we're going to test customer acquisition spend and marketing and do that $1,000 thing that Dave talked about, right? We're gonna hire a tech team because we can outsource the tech team at this stage, or we need to go find a core CTO, right? Because ultimately we're going to value the company based on the people in the company. So can I hire a tech team to build me an MVP? Yes. Am I going to build enterprise value with an outsourced tech team? No. Right? So it'll get me to a milestone, but it won't get me to enterprise value. So there's this concept of an acqui-hire that you guys I'm sure have heard about. But the idea there is that I have this team and they're great at building stuff, but the company hasn't gotten traction, right? But I've got, you know, 2 data scientists and some great programmers and engineers. I can actually sell that company as an acqui-hire based on $1 per engineer price point, right? Now, as business people don't get anything. Like it costs you money to have a business person, right? But I can sell a company for $2 or $3 million based on the number of engineers that are at the company. So know that having those engineers in-house versus outsourcing those engineers is part of it. So don't over-index this slide. This is the risk of all of these slides, right? Is depending on where you are in the maturity continuum, is you punch above your weight class and you get distracted by it and you spend too much time on a slide, and then you want to spend 2 minutes on a 5-minute pitch on a slide that you spent so much time developing. If you're at the MVP stage, it's like finish the MVP, get it in market, test marketing spend and customer acquisition, so that we can get out of the demo day and know what we're going to, they're going to be asking the question Mohammed's asking now, right? Which is, okay, now what do we need to do? Oh, now you need an 18-month plan, right? But you're an MVP, it's really just a 2-quarter plan, right? I need a 90-day plan. So, right?
One more question, Dave, which was the second question. This is like kind of a game strategy. Mm-hmm. We want to get into a market which already like people are like, the MVP's got to be lean, you know, that's experts say the MVP's got to be super lean, 1, 2, 3 pager, you know, get it out, ship it, do it. But what I can tell you that if I shipped a 1, 2, 3 pager, okay, app in a market where it is not as virgin as it was at the time, but it's now like more mature. We need what I consider an MVP is a little bit ahead of where the other players are in the game.
Right.
So that is, what do you think about that? That's,
yeah,
we have the same features, but we're not just incrementally better. We have the we're incrementally better at launch, but we have the potential to 10x that you know, betterment.
Yeah, totally. I think that is the big picture of what you're always selling. So for those of you who don't come from sales, and this feels super uncomfortable because we're out promising something we can't deliver yet, and the answer is you're a startup. Like that's the definition of what you're doing, right? Now the unrealistic side, or the too salesy side of those startup founders, is they never actually fulfill on the vision because it's always out there and it's always around the corner. And then the too practical side is like, we just don't have a big enough product vision. We can't be 10x better. Like you need to be at launch. Some things need to be at parity, unless you have found a market gap, or the customers have told you like, yeah, this product is okay, but it's just super clunky. And if you just made it better, that would be enough, right? So what you're after at this stage is like, find the unique hook, right? We talked about like the barter example on the platform. It's like, oh, well, the barter's actually, that's just a unique hook. It may not be where you ultimately end up, but it's like, people are like, it's novel. So I think, Mohammed, if you can find something novel at your launch that's incrementally better, to your point, and then you have you can sell the team on like, and here's how we get 10x better than our competitors, right? That's what you're doing is you're selling the product vision, and you're like, but we're realistic about what we need to ship. And that's always going to be the case, right? At some point you have to be able to look at it and go, how do I keep my cost of development down? Like once we get out there in the market, we can't continue to 10x the cost of development. We have to know what the features are we're going to ship so that we have confidence that that's what the customer wants, right? But you're spot on.
But so it's like, you want to be a global giant, or or you're just wasting your time or building a small business. Okay, so there's many roads to Rome, but there are faster roads to Rome. So we're like, all right, our competitors took these roads, but this is like a fast track for us to reach to the next stage faster. They're going to start trying to get customers. Sorry guys, but they're going to start trying to get merchants. We're going to start building a lot of users because that's what merchants want.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So So
no, you're totally right, and I think that you're totally right. That the thing that you're always challenged with is speed. Is the one thing that you all have advantage compared to big companies. Big companies aren't nimble; they don't move quickly. So you can move quickly. You can also move the wrong direction if you don't know what the customer wants. That's the risk, right? But just know that speed is your advantage, but you also have limited resources. So if you take the speed bet on the road to Rome and you don't bring enough provisions with you, you can also end up going like, oh, and then we ran out of cash, right? So that's the risk factor because that's, as an investor, that's what we're always looking like. Like
that's
you have
we call Dave and we're like, okay, we have a great problem.
What's that?
I'm like, that's when we call Dave and we're like, we got a great problem.
Exactly. We have this super risky bet we can make. Do we make it? And early on, that's what you're doing, right? We have limited resources. I can go this way or go that way. And it's not like there's a right decision. It's just there's part of it is a risk profile question as well. Like how comfortable are you with that risk profile? Okay. All right, so let's take a quick 15-minute break. We're gonna come back and talk about company roadmaps, and I'll lay out a company roadmap for future use. But again, if you're at the MVP stage, I want this to be super light. But we'll come back and talk about company roadmaps. But let's take 15 minutes now, go grab a cup of coffee and refresh, and then we'll be back for a few.